invite Professor Rajesh Sundaresan to take over, his Dean of EECS, Rajesh.
Welcome to this British Telecom India Research Plenary. So, plenary speaker is Professor Prakash Narayan. It's a pleasure, privilege to meet you. Professor Prakash Narayan is a professor in the Electrical Engineering Department at the University of Maryland, College Park. Before joining there, he was a bachelor's student at IIT Madras. He graduated in the mid-70s. Then subsequently got his master's and PhD from Washington University, St. Louis. He's been at the forefront of information theory and has held some leadership positions there as well. So, for example, he's been the editor-in-chief of the Integrated Transaction Foundation, associate editor for channel theory, possibly several times, and also the executive editor of Integrated Transaction Foundation. He's a fellow of the IT. I first came to know of Professor Prakash Narayan when I was a graduate student. A fellow classmate of mine had gone to University of Maryland and was working with him. He spoke very highly of the classes that he took, Prakash, and immediately went and did some research and tried to understand what kind of work he was doing. That's how I got to know about Prakash through his works. When I was doing my own PhD, I had, at that point of time, I was working on cutoff rates. I thought they, in some sense, represented algorithmic barriers for communication. And Prakash had already worked on it for his PhD thesis. His PhD thesis is on cutoff rate for the MAC, cutoff rate region for the MAC channel. Then there was another occasion, once again, in my own work to explore arbitrarily varying channels, and Prakash had done seminal work in that topic. Another topic that I encountered, once again found that Prakash had worked on that topic already, was on channels with uncertainty and coding for such channels in photon communication channels. So Prakash seems to have been everywhere, and I believe now that my thesis would not have happened without the ideas and the inspiration from Prakash's earlier works. So it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you to give this talk.
Can you hear me? Thank you, Rajesh, for that very kind introduction. It is indeed an honor for me to be invited here today to give this lecture. And this is a beautiful venue as well. It's always a pleasure for me to come to the ISC. And congratulations to the Electrical Communication Engineering Department on the occasion of its 75th anniversary. Now, this talk is on by the way, Rajesh was too generous in praising me. Yes, we worked concurrently on problems, but I've not been that far ahead of him as he mentioned. We work almost in tandem. Today's talk is on information theoretic data privacy. It's joint work with Ajay Nageshwaran. So everything that you'll see here today is a part of Ajay's PhD dissertation, which he'll defend sometime this coming fall semester at the University of Maryland. The setting is the following. There's a user with data. Think of a user database that possesses privileged information. And there's a querier, typically a consumer of data, who seeks to compute a given function of the user data. For instance, average, maximum, minimum, the median, or certain other attributes of the data. And to that end, the user is going to provide a query response using a privacy mechanism, which in effect randomizes the user data with the requirement that the user's query response must enable the querier to compute the function value that it seeks with a specified accuracy. And we call this utility or recoverability. There are lots of names for this in the privacy literature. At the same time, the user wants to make sure that the query response doesn't give away too much information about itself to the querier. And so the query response must have the attribute that it preserves data or distribution privacy. And I'll make these notes precise as we go along. The overarching questions that we seek to address in this work is what are appropriate metrics or measures for accuracy or function computation and for privacy? What are privacy mechanisms that maximize privacy under the accuracy requirement? And what are the exact and precise trade-offs between accuracy or function computation and the best privacy that can be attained in a given model? So here's the outline of the talk. It's going to consist of two main segments. The first one is on data privacy, where I'll focus. On yeah, here we go. Where I'll focus on data row privacy, and I'll speak briefly about predicate privacy and list privacy, which are more stringent forms of data privacy, and say a few words about Gaussian privacy. And then I'll go to distribution privacy, propose an approach, and then examine links to a link to differential privacy, which is the dominant form of privacy today. And then throughout the talk, there'll be open problems. So Professor Himanshu Tyagi suggested that I present open questions that will be of interest to PhD students here. It's an excellent idea, and I shall follow it. So let's start with data privacy, which is the first part of the talk. And here's the model. There's a user that has data that's going to be modeled by a random variable X. It can be a random vector. And here's a querier who seeks to compute a function of the data. So F is a given mapping, for instance, to compute the average, or the maximum, or the minimum. And F is a mapping from the set script X, where the random variable X takes its values. I just say random variable, it could be a vector as well. To a set script Z, I'll say more about it shortly. And so the function takes values in the set script Z. Now, the user devices query response denoted by a random variable Z, which in effect is a randomization of the data X. So the query response will be denoted by F of X or Z, F being the capital F. And later we'll see that it can also be described in terms of what's called a stochastic matrix. Now, the user devises the query response F of X, capital F of X, in such a way that for every value of the data, the probability that the query response equals the true function value is at least rho. Rho is going to be a parameter that's going to be decided by the application at hand. And this should hold for every data value and for a value of rho that is specified. Observe that when rho equal to 1, the query recovers the function value with probability 1. And all this should be done in such a way that data privacy is maximized. And I'll say what this means shortly. Now, applications, there are plenty. There are, for instance, individual user data must be protected when aggregate statistics of student grades or demographic information on students are released from a university database. Success rates of clinical drug trials are provided by a hospital database without compromising individual user data. Or third-party applications that request and receive social media user profiles and individual user information must not be compromised. So returning to the model, there are two concepts, recoverability and privacy. Recoverability is going to be a constraint under which we are going to try and maximize privacy. So the user data X is a random variable or vector which takes values in a set script X. So the random variable for now is discrete value, in fact takes finitely many values, and the set SX script X has cardinality R. As I said before, so we'll assume that X is a random variable of known probability mass function. And we just saw what query wants to do. It seeks to compute this function f of X for a given little f. And the query response must enable recoverability, and we'll see what data privacy is. All right, to make the notion of recoverability precise, it's called rho recoverable. So given a value of rho between 0 and 1, a query response, hereafter abbreviated as QR, is going to be row recoverable if this recoverability condition is satisfied. Namely, for every data value, the function value must be recovered by the querier from the query response with probability at least row. Now, equivalently, the query response can also be represented in terms of a stochastic matrix from the set script X to the set script Z. X is the place where the random variable takes its values, and Z is where the query response, capital F of X, or the random variable Z take their values. And it's going to be a matrix of size with R rows and K columns. Each row is going to be a probability mass function. And for a given value of the data X, the probability mass function gives us the probabilities with which that data value is mapped randomly into a query response value. That every row is going to be a probability mass function, one corresponding to each possible value of the data. So such a query response is called a row recoverable QR or row QR, the term I'm going to use hereafter. And that stands for the query response capital F of X or the stochastic matrix W. And I should emphasize that this is something that is chosen by the user. Now, what is privacy? Data privacy for a given row QR, F or W. Privacy, the data privacy for a given value of row is a constraint on the recoverability. Well, it's the minimum probability of error made by the querier in estimating the data value X from the query response capital F of X. And this minimum is taken over all possible estimators that the querier can design. So clearly, this minimum is going to be attained by the maximum a posteriori estimation rule, or the MAP rule. And the estimator G is chosen by the querier. So this is for a fixed query response, and row privacy, which is what we are after in this talk, is denoted by pi of rho. You will see this over and over again, is the maximum privacy that can be attained by the user by using any row QR. And so it's the maximum of this thing here, which was for a fixed query response, now maximized over all query responses chosen by the user, which satisfy the row recovery constraint. And the goals here are to first characterize this pi of rho, which for every value of rho, which determines or specifies the best trade-off between utility and privacy or between recoverability and privacy. And then devise explicit privacy mechanisms that attain pi of rho. Are there any questions at this point? So please ask as I go along. So there's a very rich and large literature in this area of data privacy. Much of it is recent. The work can be broadly classified into three groups, which are listed here. The first one, rate distortion-like approaches. Then, of course, differential privacy, and approaches that are based on statistical methods, cryptography, and so on. I mentioned just a sampling of works in each of these areas. Is by no means an exhaustive survey. I'll just say a few words about differential privacy, which is the dominant privacy mechanism today. And in fact, differential privacy rules the privacy landscape. And there's been a large body of work where the data is the input to a differential privacy mechanism, and the output of the differential privacy mechanism, which is a randomized query response. Then it's studied how well does this randomized query response come close to the function value that needs to be computed by a querier. So under a discrepancy cost between the true function value and the output of the query of the differential privacy mechanism, measures have been studied that minimize the discrepancy, thereby maximizing recoverability of the function value. There are also studies that deal with estimation of parameters related to the actual data. Now, our approach is different, it's new, and can be viewed as a companion approach. So what's new in our approach? We impose a constraint on recoverability. So recoverability is essential by the query of the function value. And under the constraint on the recoverability, we try to find out what's the maximum privacy that can be attained. The models that we have are simple, they are rudimentary, and also the measures for recoverability and privacy, as you just saw for discrete data, we use a conditional probability as recoverability. For analog data, for privacy, you'll see that we use the minimum mean square error. And then for privacy, we use the probability of error for discrete data. For analog data, it will be the mean square error. And for distribution privacy, it will be the Kullback-Leibler divergence, but more on that later. And this approach of ours has been governed by a need for tractability and for exact or near exact computations, which give us the exact trade-off between utility or recoverability on the one hand and privacy on the other. And one feature of our approach is that we are able to characterize explicitly privacy mechanisms that are optimal or asymptotically optimal in attaining these best trade-offs. So it was Professor Himanshu Tyagi who encouraged me to work in this area, and he and Shun Watanabe educated Ajay and me on the basics of secure function computation. They helped us formulate some of the initial models, and we benefited from our discussions with them. So Ajay and I are very grateful to Himanshu and Shun, and if there's any aspect of the job that you don't like, you know to pay. Now, getting back to privacy, here's an effective privacy mechanism that I'm going to screw up. It's called the adenoise rho QR, and it's a very simple thing. So what the user does is computes a function value that the query seeks and adds to it a noise n modular k because the set Z has alphabet size, has cardinality k. Now, this noise n is not independent noise. It's a Z-valued noise that depends on the function value. Precisely, the noise, the distribution of the noise, condition on the function value, and the data is conditionally independent of the data. And so, this conditional distribution of the noise given the function value translates to a conditional distribution for the query response condition on the function value through this relationship. And so for any I and j in the set Z where the query response takes its values, the conditional probability that the query response is I, given that the functional value is j, is denoted by Bij. So Bij becomes a stochastic matrix now. All the rows add probabilities, they add up to 1. And in particular, all the diagonal elements must be at least rho in order to meet the recoverability condition, the rho recoverability condition. And so throughout this talk, one of the objectives is if we are able to characterize the best trade-off between privacy and recoverability, we also try to find explicitly the privacy mechanism that attains that trade-off. And that will be specified through this V matrix. So you'll see this V matrix appearing over and over again. And V is a stand-in for this conditional distribution of how the noise is chosen. And the noise statistics condition on the function value can be stated in a very explicit way. Okay, so here's the first, here's the pro-privacy pi and rho, the trade-off between pi, rho, and rho in the simplest setting for a single query response. And throughout this talk, these optimal trade-offs will be, and the privacy mechanisms that obtain them will be stated as theorems in the heading of the slide, and the pertinent references will appear as footnotes at the bottom. Now, here is pi of rho as a function of rho, and as you see, pi of rho is constant in the zone and then drops linearly, and at rho equal to 1, pi of 1 is the privacy that can be obtained when the querier knows the full function value, because rho equal to 1 corresponds to a full knowledge by the querier of the function value. Now, there are a few parameters that are of interest. First, X star is the maximum probability symbol. That is a symbol which contains the maximum probability for the data random variable. Need not be unique. And X star is the locally maximum probability symbol. So for every function value, look at all the set of data values that map into that function value and take the maximum over this inverse image or inverse atom, and that will be called Xi star. So Xi star is the locally maximum probability symbol, X star is the maximum probability symbol, and the corresponding probabilities will be the maximum probabilities and the locally maximum probabilities. So between rho and 0 and rho sub c, pi of rho is equal to pi of 0, it's constant, and it's 1 minus pxx tau, which is the map estimation for error when the query has an observation. Low values of rho, the query response provides no useful information to the query, as the query simply picks the maximum probability symbol as the estimate for the data. At the other extreme, when rho equal to 1, pi of 1 is going to be a case where for rho equal to 1, the query knows the function value by definition. And so it forms the best estimate, which is the map estimate for the data on the basis of the function value. And the corresponding error is going to be 1 minus the sum of the locally maximum probability. So that is this one here. So that's pi of 1, and pi of 1 will come back in a few slides. Now, as I said before, in all of these cases, the B matrix or the add noise mechanism can also be specified exactly. Now, to prove a result like that, there are two steps. The first is a converse or an impossibility result says it says that under the parameters of under the conditions of the model, rho privacy that exceeds this cannot be obtained. The second part is called the attainability or achievability, where we find an explicit privacy mechanism that attains this level of privacy. And in this particular case, rho privacy can be obtained by an add noise rho QR. I won't get into the details of this, but to say that this is the V matrix that attains it. We observe that rho privacy, this rho privacy achieving privacy mechanism need not be unique, is not unique. And both the rho privacy, which is the best trade-off, and the V, which is the privacy mechanism that attains it, depend on the distribution of the data only through the locally maximum probabilities. And these are related to what are known as bin entropies that are very popular in the privacy literature. Okay, so that's for a single query response. Now, in general, the query seeks multiple query responses. So the query wishes to compute f of x from multiple rho QRs f1 through fn. And these rho QRs are conditionally mutually independent given the data x, but they need not be identically distributed, so they needn't be IID. But each of these query responses must individually satisfy the rho recovery. Each of them. That's a strong requirement on the query response. Now, we can also view the setup as one in which there are n queries, and these n queries seek independent query responses from the user, and then they cooperate or collude by pulling together their query responses to form a better estimate of the data value. That's another interpretation for this model. So rho privacy now, in this case, is defined in a similar way. It is the privacy for these query responses, which can also be represented by stochastic matrices, each of which must satisfy the rho recoverability constraint. And wanted to say here that this is the stringent recoverability requirement that is imposed on every query response because it makes for a deliberate bias against the user and therefore provides us with a conservative diminished amount of privacy, and this is what we wanted in the privacy studies. This Y multiple rho QR, this formulation is appropriate when the main objective of the query is to improve estimation accuracy beyond a given value of rho. For when a value of rho is given, but by seeking multiple query responses, the query can estimate the function value with a probability higher than rho. Where at the same time, the query designs these query responses to maximize the privacy. In fact, if you look at it just from the viewpoint of the query, for values of rho lying between 0.5 and 1, greater than 0.5, which is the interesting region which is the worthwhile region of interest. For the query, the map estimator for f of x on the basis of these conditionally independent rho QRs f1 through f1 enjoys the property of consistency. So if I look at the probability, the map estimator on the basis of f1 through fn estimates f of x in the limit as n tends to infinity, this goes to 1. Right? So in the limit as n goes to infinity, the query knows the function value. However, these multiple rho QRs can degrade data privacy. So this kind of analysis is known as compositional analysis in the privacy literature, where the query is given many benefits, and so the odds are sort of stacked against the user. And the idea is to see how the composition of these benefits given to the query leads to a degradation in privacy for the user. Yeah, Radhi. Yeah. This one?
It looks like if there are too many queries, one strategy that the responder can employ is to give the same response again and again when there are too many queries.
Yeah.
But somehow in that max, when you do the maximization across the values, are you allowing yourself as a responder the flexibility to not give a new response each time?
That's right. So again, so Raj's question is, the user can give the same response and thereby stifle the attempts of the query to estimate the data value. But here we're trying to give as many benefits to the query as possible. So in this business, the idea is to give preference to the query and look for conservative estimates of privacy. And that's why these independent queries are being as well. And in the same way, that's the reason why each query response has to be fully comparable rather than an average first. So here we are. Now, we saw that, of course, in the limit as it tends to infinity, the query is going to learn the function value. And then when the query knows the function value, we've seen in the first problem that the privacy is pi of 1. And so upon learning the function value, we know that pi of 1 will be the amount of privacy, but because for any finite n, fixed n, we can hope that the user gets more privacy. And what this converse result says is that for every row and for every value of n, maybe pi of rho is bigger than pi of 1, but it cannot be more than pi of 1 plus something. It depends on n and rho. And there is an achievability result which says that for a row line between 0.5 and 1, and for every n, indeed the row privacy is for every value when it's bigger than pi of 1 plus something lambda n of the row. And it can be attained where both gamma n and lambda n, they tend to 0 as n tends to infinity, and they tend to 0 exponentially fast with an exponent which equals the Kullback-Leibler divergence between a Bernoulli 0.5 random variable and a co-random variable. That's going to be positive because rho is strictly bigger than 1. And it also means for rho bigger than 0.5, the limit of the rho privacy as n tends to infinity is in fact equal to the map estimation error for the query in estimating x on the basis of a full knowledge of the function value, which is pi. And in fact, throughout this talk, you'll see evidence of the fact that this approach lends itself to the derivation or the specification of an explicit privacy response. And in this case, this is the Adeno's mechanisms through the matrix, stochastic matrix P. It looks like this. So there are these blocks of positive values, rho and 1 minus rho, and then zeros elsewhere. There's diagonal blocks. Observe here that B does not depend on the probability mass function of the data and variable. Now, so the first set of open questions. We've seen that when we measure recoverability, it's a conditional probability. But when we measure privacy, it's a probability of error. So the question is, what if we have a pointwise measure of data privacy? In other words, for every value of the query response, look at the probability of error of the map estimator for the query, and look at the minimum over all values of the observations of the query, and then maximize it with respect to the queries, the user's choice of a query response. This is a more conservative measure of privacy. What is the answer in this case? Are the qualitative aspects of the answer any different from what we saw when we used the probability of error? This is not known. And this problem is not easy to deal with. Are there better metrics of data privacy? Yes, of course. Privacy, if we measure them privacy measured in terms of more discerning measures such as L1 instances. Those will penalize the deviation between the true the query's estimate of the function of the data and its true value, which the probability of error is not true. Will the resulting insights be different qualitatively? And then we saw just now that when we have multiple query responses, ad-noise query responses are asymptotically off. But for moderate values of n, which are of practical interest, are the better query responses which will give us better privacy. Is there no general row QRs, which are not ad-noise but can be represented in terms of the stochastic matrix W, which could depend on the description of the data. Can they strictly and provably outperform ad-noise schemes for moderate values of n? Okay. Now there are most questions.
Is it allowed to change capital, small f of x?
Yeah, okay. So Chandra asked the question. The querier can the querier change the value of f during the querying process? Now that is beyond the scope of this work, and serial querier can indeed do that to narrow down the scope of values of x over which it has to search. I don't know what the answer is. There must be additional constraints placed on the querier, because otherwise it can do what it wants. Right? Yeah. Now there are more stringent notions of data privacy. One is predicate privacy, the other one is known as disk privacy. In both these cases, the user must furnish a query response from which the querier must be able to estimate or recover the function value with a known probability, probability of rho. But the user devises the query responses so as to maximize privacy, and maximizing privacy is tantamount to minimizing likelihoods. In the case of predicate privacy, minimizing the likelihood by the querier of learning a function of the data value which is different from the function x, and this is called the predicate. And in this privacy, the user devises the query response to minimize the likelihood of the querier estimating a list of a prescribed size, little n, let's say, to which the data value belongs. And then these minimum probabilities are maximized over the choice of row QRs that are furnished, that are used by the user. Predicate privacy, well, let me just say, predicate privacy is appropriate when the user wants to safeguard some statistics while releasing others. For instance, it wants to safeguard gender information or ethnicity information for students when student grades have been furnished. And so little f stands for statistics or student grades, whereas the predicate h of x, which is a special function, is the one that must be guarded. This privacy, of course, we know, it prevents winnow and conquer, where the querier can first form a list of potential data values and then work at leisure to reduce that list further. Now, this privacy, I should say, we were discussing, discussing this particular scheme with Himanshu at some conference, and Himanshu looked at this and observed that yes, this may be very good for privacy, data privacy, but if the querier were to form a list, then this would be a scheme where for a list of size 2, then the user would be in trouble. And so that led to the concept of this privacy. This privacy, of course, is relevant of list decoding in information theory. Now, predicate privacy can be analyzed using the same approach that we have, this small extension for data privacy. This privacy is a difficult to crack. In fact, we have an upper bound, a converse upper bound for this privacy, which looks like this, where it has to decrease, privacy has to decrease as recoverability increases. And it does so in this piecewise linear fashion. I'm not going to say too much about it. This picture has an equation associated with it. For binary value functions, there's this privacy mechanism which will attain this upper bound that is attached to the converse. This upper bound has this beautiful formula. It's forbidding. I won't get into it, but let me explain what's going on. For low values of rho, the query response is useless as far as the query is concerned. So to form a list of size L, it simply picks the L largest probability values from the alphabet X and declares them to constitute the list. At the other extreme, when rho equal to 1, the query knows the function value. So what does it do? It looks at the function value, let's say it's I, looks at the inverse image or the inverse atom of data values which were mapped into I, and picks the largest probability symbols to constitute the list of size L. On the other hand, if the inverse image is smaller than L, it simply chooses the inverse image or the inverse atom to constitute the list, and then forgoes the other elements that would be on the list. And for intermediate values of rho, this upper bound that you just saw captures the trade-off between these two extremes, where the query picks some of the values from the list from a general pool of high probability values, and then picks the rest from the inverse image of the function value that it has just estimated. Open problems, as I said, we don't know what this privacy is. It's a wide open question in general, and what is a precise characterization of this L-row privacy? How good is the upper bound that we've got? It seemed heuristically justified, but maybe this is not the best way to do it. Of course, this upper bound is tight for binary valued functions, as I mentioned, and it's also tight when the list is of size 1, but can it be improved in general? What are good privacy mechanisms? Are noise privacy mechanisms adequate for attaining this row privacy? If yes, what are they? If they're not, what are they? So this problem is completely open. Now, one of the attributes of this approach is that we can look at problems we can do similar studies for the privacy of analog data. Of course, the techniques that I use will be different from what they saw earlier. So as an example, Ajay was interested in Gaussian data privacy, and he considered the following model. The user data is modeled by Gaussian random vector, A0, and the covariance matrix being the identity matrix of size n. Now, I'm sure that an arbitrary positive vector matrix can also be handled, but there was some computational difficulty, which I'm sure can be overcome. But for this topic, it's the identity matrix. And a query seeks to compute a linear function of the data, a matrix A times X, where A is a matrix with real valued entries and of size n by n, has rank R. And to enable the query to do this, the user devices a query response C, which is in effect a conditional distribution of Z given X, such that a recoverability condition is satisfied. It says the mean square error between the true value of the function AX and the query response should not exceed rho. Now, in this case, larger values of rho means poorer recoverability, and as rho increases, we can expect privacy to increase, unlike in the previous case. And the user devices this query response such that data privacy is maximized, and data privacy is measured as the minimum mean square error for the query in estimating X on the basis of its observation of the query response C. And this is going to be the minimum mean square error estimator. And then this is maximized over all query responses that satisfy the recoverability constraint. So Ajay actually was able did characterize the row privacy for this case. It is in terms of the singular values of the matrix A. The best privacy looks like this. It increases as rho increases, and there's an adverse mechanism that contains it. But coming to the open problems, this is an open direction in general, and this example on which Ajay worked is actually a first foray, and there are a number of open problems to be formulated, and many spin-offs that will come out of this direction. For instance, if we use LP and LQ distance matrices instead of the mean square error, will the answer is qualitatively different? What happens when you have multiple query responses? And in general, here the query wanted to compute a linear function of data, but what if it's an arbitrary function of data for a measurable f? What happens? So this problem area is completely open. All right, so this brings us to distribution privacy. And let's start with distribution privacy. So what is distribution privacy? So here are two futuristic applications that may serve to motivate this area. So this problem area. Look at an IoT, consists of users and sensors. The users issue commands in the akin to query responses, and the sensors must be able to recover these commands for execution purposes. So this is recoverability of function values. But the sensor measurements must not compromise the details of user habits. For instance, the distribution of user preferences through a day, the relative frequencies of the user's commands during the course of the day. So that's distribution privacy. Or we look at an AI-driven financial trader who makes daily bids and shows the trading preferences. So that's function recoverability without giving away the workings of an underlying probabilistic algorithm, which is distribution privacy. So how do we model such a situation? Here is one approach. The user generates data x1 through x, then IID according to mass function px, and then the data is randomized using a fixed stochastic matrix W, a fixed privacy mechanism. The output will be the query responses z1 through zn. They will be IID, and with the probability mass function, which is the composition of px and w. And then the querier is required to compute the function values f of x1 through f of xn from each of these query responses with probability at least rho. Now, the querier might seek to estimate the distribution of x. So, using the observation z1 through zn, it tries to form an estimate of px, and which is what the user tries to determine. The user devises the probability mass function px and the randomization mechanism w, or privacy mechanism, whereas the querier forms an estimate p hat of n of the probability mass function px from the query responses. So is this problem formulation clear? Now, distribution row privacy. Yes. Distribution row privacy is defined as follows. We look at the divergence, the overlap divergence between the probability mass function px of the data that is chosen by the user and the estimate of px formed by the query on the basis of the query responses z1 through zn. Now, this divergence is a random variable because it depends on z1 through zn. So we take the expectation of zn. And there are these maximums and minimums. So the outer maximum is with respect to the query response W. With respect to the privacy mechanism W, such that it satisfies the condition. The minimum is with respect to the query's estimate of px, and the maximum is inner maximum is with respect to the user's choice of the probability mass function px. Now, it turns out that this is the right order for taking the maxes and the min, and any permutation of these or exchanging the rows of px and p hat of n in the divergence would lead to unrealistic answers that are not this works. We also note here that p hat of n can depend on the randomization mechanism. So the model is deliberately again biased against the user to make for a good estimate of privacy. I want to say something more here. So another interpretation of this model, of course, is that you don't have multiple query responses, but you have n queryers, and each of them is seeking a query response, and then later they pool their query responses to form an estimate of px. Did you have a question? All right, now there's also a philosophical interpretation of this. Nature chooses generates its sequence according to a distribution that comes out of this, which maximizes this, to make it difficult for a model to fathom its secrets. But it releases its secrets in the form of query responses, and using the query responses, querier seeks to learn the workings of inner workings of nature, and of course with mixed successes. And what our results also will show is that a model query will never learn nature's secrets fully, the workings behind nature's secrets, even after an eternity or an eternity. Now, of course, I'm not being fully serious when I intersperse information theory with philosophical claims. And in fact, all my philosophical arguments anyway turn out to be full of holes. Now, the question is, how do you why choose divergence, and how do you address a problem of this kind? So here are heuristics which again are found useful. These are in terms of the inverse atoms of the mapping F. So here's the set X, here's the mapping F going from X to Z, and 0 through K minus 1 are K values that the query response will take, right? If you look at the inverse images, I'm going to call them inverse atoms. Now, any reasonable measure, any meaningful measure of distribution privacy must display the following qualitative feature. The lower the atomicity of F, in other words, the fewer these inverse atoms, the larger they are, the more able the user is to conceal its probability mass function from the query. And this notion of divergence brings out this heuristic in a precise way. In fact, all our answers depend on the function F only through the sizes of the inverse atoms. And distribution rho privacy turns out to be the log of the sum of the cardinalities of the sizes of some of these inverse atoms, where the number of summons increases as rho increases, in other words, as the query recovers the function value with increasing reliability. And in fact, these heuristics lead to the notion of lead to an attainable low order distribution privacy, which is also called the worst case of distribution low privacy, which the user is guaranteed for all values of n. And it is in fact in terms of the log of the cardinalities or the size of the inverse atoms that I mentioned. And the number of terms in the sum will be determined by the value of rho. Now, rather than go through this formula, here's a way to understand it by picture. So assume that we order the inverse atoms according to their sizes. F inverse of 0 is the largest one, F inverse of K minus 1 is the smallest one. Now, in the interesting zone where rho lies between the recoverability probability lies between half and 1, all the action is on this inverse atom, the largest inverse atom that is shaded here. The user puts a point mass in the zone, there is no randomization, and the best thing that the query can do is to put a uniform distribution on all the elements of X that lie here. As a rho decreases, namely the recoverability probability decreases, more atoms, inverse atoms come into play. So for instance, for rho line between 1/3 and a half, these two inverse atoms come into play. The best strategy for the user is to put a point mass somewhere in the union of these two shaded areas. And the randomization is an adverse mechanism that makes the output of the randomization mechanism make 0 and 1 as the outputs look uniform. So if you look at the output of the privacy mechanism, it's a sequence of zeros and ones which occur roughly equal to nothing. And as the value of rho decreases further, here we go. When rho is less than 1/k at the other extreme, all these inverse atoms are in play. The user puts a point mass somewhere here in this whole region. The randomization mechanism is an adverse mechanism which makes all the outputs equally probable. And the best thing that the query can do is to put a uniform distribution on the input symbols. And this is the worst case privacy. For a fixed value of n, we can hope for a privacy level which is more than the worst case. And in fact, for every value of rho in this interval and for every value of n, the rho privacy can be more than the worst case privacy, but no more than omega rho plus this gamma of n. And for values of rho between all values of rho between 0 and 1, we can obtain more privacy, which is equal to omega of rho plus a lambda n of rho times a little lambda n of rho. where the capital gamma n, and the lambda n tends to 0, the little lambda n tends to 1, and the row privacy in the limit to infinity actually moves to the worst case privacy. And there are explicit matching strategies that can be identified that the user uses and the query uses to estimate the distribution of the user. And a specific randomizing mechanism can also be explicitly stated. So note that it consists of these blocks of rows, and the remaining probabilities are distributed in a suitable way, and there are zeros in this randomized mechanism. So we'll come back to that. And B does not depend on the distribution of the data. All right, now coming to the open problems. Here's a suggested framework for examining our approach to distribution privacy in the context of differential privacy. Now, what is differential privacy? Consider a user database. So that holds data from multiple users. So in our notation, each little value of x will be a vector, and the components of this vector will be individual users' data. Differential privacy stipulates that a small change in this data vector will lead to near perceptible changes in the probability distribution of the output of the differential privacy mechanism. Now, of course, in our work, there is no notion of the closeness of data sets, but there is an altered form of differential privacy, which is pertinent here, and thus known as local differential data privacy. It's defined as follows. For a given epsilon positive, which is called the level of the LDP or local differential privacy, a query response or a randomization mechanism is epsilon LDP if this ratio is satisfied. So what this says is that for a given output of the probability mechanism, for any two inputs, namely the data vectors, this ratio is always bounded about this way. And this is true for all values of x and x prime, including when x and x prime are interchanged. Now, how can this be incorporated in our model? Well, we have the data distribution model here. The randomization mechanism that we had earlier now is required to satisfy an epsilon LDP constraint. So which means that we provide local differential privacy for data in this case. Now, the imposition of this additional LDP constraint has the following implications. First, the rho QRs W or the adenoids rho QR V that might be used here cannot have zeros, because if we have zeros, then this condition will not be satisfied. And the zeros were useful in our analysis of distribution privacy. The other implication is that the recoverability probability rho is limited above in this way, so it can't get arbitrarily to 1. Question now becomes, what is distribution privacy under these circumstances? What are the best trade-offs? What are the best strategies for the user and for the querier? This is a wide open question. This promises to be a challenging question, difficult question, but it should be a fun question. Now, we talked about Kullback-Leibler divergence, but of course, there is the general notion of F divergences. What happens if we replace the Kullback-Leibler divergence by an F divergence? Are the results qualitatively different? Of course, F divergence also has other interesting special cases other than Kullback-Leibler divergence. What is the answer in those cases? And a larger question, are there better models for distribution privacy than the one that we have been looking at? If so, they ought to be analytically tractable, they ought to be able to provide optimum recoverability privacy trade-offs and explicit user and query mechanisms for taking this trade-off. This remains an open question too. So in closing, our approach offers new and rudimentary formulations. One of the advantages is tractability, and the analysis is based on very basic first principles and ideas from applied probability. Although in the case of distribution row privacy, we had to resort to ideas from information geometry, especially first rejection. But otherwise, the techniques are very standard or known. It offers useful insights, but also suffers from shortcomings. For instance, it lacks the refinement or the nuances of privacy. On the other hand, it suggests a framework that enables the links to local literature privacy. And above all, I think it raises interesting questions in a very rich and evolving area, which I hope will stir interest in some of you. Thank you.
Now open for questions. Yes.
Thank you for your talk. Recently, there has been recent initiative in the last 2 years for voice privacy. Doing the privacy for the voice recognition, speaker identification. So there is a voice privacy challenge that were organized, where the approach is to perturb the speech waveform from different speakers.
Yeah.
The perturbation could be in the form of spectrum, like for resonant frequencies or the speed, pitch, loudness, and other such aspects. And the perturbation could be in the form of deep learning-based approaches like cycle-GAN and all. So the justification given for that approaches was like cryptography-based methods are computationally intensive, like homomorphic encryption and description. So signal processing approaches are used. So my question was, this important work having the analytical approach from information theory, I did not see in those line of work in the voice privacy. So in that aspect, my first question is that if in the definition of privacy you mentioned the vector X can contain several elements where each element is like the data from the user. Yeah. So I just wanted to understand the relevance. What is your opinion? Like in our speech, the data is, let's say, one-dimensional vector, and it is coming from several users with several speakers. There are suppose 100 speakers, so the vector contains 100 dimensions. Each dimension is one speaker. So in that context, my question is, how do you see the open questions or challenges? Should this work is viewed from the voice privacy?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. So I should acknowledge a priori that this is very initial work, and I'd say that this proposes an approach rather than looking at the details of specific problems where it could be applied. And as I said, even this approach, I'm not sure it's the best under different circumstances. Two things I can say, comparison with differential privacy, we were interested in getting numerical results which were computations. Now, we recently have had access to US Census data, but we have to take the data and put it in a form which is compatible with this approach and also makes for fair comparisons. And that's not been easy, and that's one of the things that Ajay is working on now in addition to writing a dissertation. Now, coming to your question specifically, if you have various attributes of speech which you want to protect, speaker identification, where you want to protect speaker identification. So first, the model will have to be changed to incorporate these features that you are seeking. I'm sorry? For us, we are releasing a function of the data, f of x, but if you release the entire data, with perturbation factor. Yeah, of course. So then, of course, it's f is going to be the identity function in that case. I don't know how well this is performed. That will be calculation. So this is an arbitrary function f, and in your case, you're releasing everything but adding noise, for instance. The approach will fit your model. I don't know what the specific results will be without doing the calculations. So it's a long answer for saying really nothing, but I think the approach could be in your situation. I don't know how the specifics will change.
Whether there is any restriction for that F,
being one dimension or multi-dimensional.
No, there's no restriction at all. Absolutely no restriction.
Mathematically, it can be like one dimension, two dimension function.
Yeah. S can be anything. So X can be a vector, whereas
Because in our case, the recoverability,
Sure.
recoverability is measured as a perceptual measurement,
Yeah.
as a speech intelligibility.
yeah, sure.
So that mathematics of course is different.
Sure.
So we are using the perceptual feature of how much we are able to see the speech is intelligible in terms of anonymized voices. Sure.
So X can be data itself can be multidimensional, it can be a random field model, for instance. S can be multidimensional, but then you have to write down all the details of the calculation to see what you
And another, sorry,
So I have a question and a comment, both on the connection to differential privacy. So first, you mentioned that differential privacy is present everywhere. I would say it's in the computer science literature. Actually, GDPR makes an explicit comment, the working party for Article 20 made an explicit comment saying it's not sufficient for legal privacy. So when we design practical privacy, I think the jury is still out. There's no differential privacy. It's not necessary that if you're differentially private, then you are legally compliant for privacy.
Okay.
So that opens up scope for new notion of privacy.
Sure. Thank you.
That's one part. The second comment is about your first definition of privacy. So you have a prior PX on the data, and then you have this parameter rho. I think if you think of this data as x1 to xn, then if you look at the prior where the distribution only on 2 points, two vectors will differ only on one coordinate. That will correspond to epsilon delta difference.
That is true, yeah.
Is that it?
It is true. In fact, Shun, when he was in Maryland, had a good calculation that showed that differential privacy could be written as a special case if you have a family of probability mass functions, not a single probability.
No, I think the specific one is that's what I see. That rho is there's a particular probability mass function.
Yeah.
And so you have to work for all of them.
Yeah, that's why. Yeah, you're right. So you can have a fixed probability mass function which targets two symbols, and then you have a family so that every pair is and in fact, one of the interpretations of this is that here we said that the data privacy is known to everybody and it's used in the calculations, but the privacy depends on the data probability mass function only through these min entities. So all distributions which have the same entities and entities will give the same level of privacy. The other question is that is the probability mass function really known? It could be that there's a prior belief that the query has about the data being right. There's a family. Yeah. It's a belief of the adversary. So you have a family of mass functions. And if you take this approach and compute the row privacy for each one of these probabilities in the family and the corresponding query response, and take the query response that corresponds to the minimizing probability where the privacy is minimized with respect to the prior belief, then that query response provides a guaranteed amount of privacy. It's a min-max which talks about.
Yes. Hi, thank you very much for the talk.
Thank you.
There are two very response mechanisms that I'm because one was the V matrix, the other was the W. If I remember, V was putting the mass of 2 elements, while W was generic.
No. So W is a general query response. So there are X symbols, there are of them actually, and there are the Z's which are in the column, there are K of them. So the general stochastic matrix W is R times K. And each row is a probability mass function which says that for that corresponding input symbol, what are the probabilities of the various query response values, right? So it's a general R by K matrix. Now the B query response is one where the user first computes the function value f of x. So we are now reduced to K values, and each of them is mapped into a query response values. All those also take K values. So V is now a stochastic matrix of size K by K. And there is a relationship between the W and the V. So if you have an adverse query response, which is represented by V, it can also be represented by a W. So anytime you have a W, where if I look at the function value and look at its inverse image, and look at those x's that correspond to the inverse image, if the rows are identical, then this corresponds to an adverse query response. That's the connection.
Thank you.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah, thanks again for a very nice talk.
thank you.
So in your formulation of framework, there was, except for when you brought in this differential privacy and so on, there was essentially no constraint that you were putting on the type of W or whatever this mechanism, privacy mechanism,
Yeah.
mechanism, this query response mechanism. So that there are, but for example, in speech data or other type of data, there is limitations on what you can do to the data in order to provide your query response.
Yeah.
So that essentially means that you are constraining the set of query responses or types of query responses that you can actually use for your privacy.
Yeah.
So, for example, I guess in this context, perhaps from the generic W, you only have a low rank.
That is right. Yeah.
So, do you have do you have an understanding, or is there any understanding of such?
No, this is really the first work we've done in this area, and no, the answer is no. We've never tried out any of these cases. We don't know what the structure of W will be, even with just the epsilon LBP constraint, because we used in the proofs for distribution privacy were the hardest that Ajay and I have worked on. So we really struggled over those. We had, there were times when we were really lost and we were groping for ideas, and we sort of plucked ideas from different places. And I'm sure that there's a more efficient way of doing what we did, except we don't know at this point. There might be a better way of seeing it. And so new ideas are really needed. And yes, if you impose more constraints on W, that's going to make things more difficult because, and I don't know what the optimal answer will be. So I should say this. So even in this case, the optimum or asymptotically optimum strategies for the user and the querier, we didn't solve the optimization problem, but we used our heuristics to guess at what would be close to being optimal. And one of the things that helped us in a big way was what I refer to as matching strategy. So if you have a user and if you're trying to show a converse result, then the querier is trying to minimize this divergence, right? So if we limit the querier, we restrict the querier to use what we call the locally uniform estimate strategy. But at a higher level, if you restrict the querier in some way, then we show that some strategies are good for the user without compromising privacy. When we go to the achievability part of the proof, where we have to come up with specific strategies for the user, it turns out that the roles of restriction and adequacy are reversed, and it's sort of fortuitous that we got that. Whether this structure played a big role in arriving at the final answers. Whether such a structure will obtain when you have additional constraints, we don't know.
We have two more questions.
Thanks for, so this question is again related to the connection to the differential privacy. So, so differential privacy enjoys quite nice properties like post-processing preserves privacy, and there is a compositional theorem as well. So first question is, does your approach also, or does this model also follows the same properties? And the second question, I'll just ask both the questions together. Have you come across non-add noise type of privacy mechanisms? Can you comment?
Yeah. So yes, let me answer the second question first. Yes, in some of these works, we did run into general Ws, which give us the answer. One of the things I don't know is when you have these multiple query responses, when the ad noise was optimum, whether a general W will give a better answer. My guess is it will be. This is our conjecture, but we don't know. And in the first question, you talked about compositional results. So of course, we saw that for multiple query responses for data privacy, there is a compositional property. And for all values of recoverability probability like greater than 0.5, that in fact, data privacy can be driven to its worst value, which is 5.1. That's the most I know at this point. For the case of distribution privacy, again, you saw that as you have composition in terms of multiple queries, the answer gets down to the worst case privacy. More than that, I don't. So there are a number of, we have, I think, solved only the very basic primitive problems in this area. I don't know about the finer aspects of this approach. Yeah. And I think those are among the open questions that could be examined. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, about the attacker's perspective, that whether there is a chance that the attacker can exploit the knowledge of noise distribution and then try to defeat the anonymization of privacy mechanism.
Yeah. So if you look at distribution privacy, the model allows the query who's trying to estimate the probability distribution of the user to depend on the privacy mechanism. So W is revealed because it's max over view at the outside. Then there's minimum over the estimator, and then there's a maximum over the distribution. At least in that particular context, the querier is allowed knowledge of the randomization. Okay, yeah.
Next time,
Thank you.
as a token of our appreciation, we have some organic tea.
Oh,
and
wonderful.
to enjoy the web.
Thank you very much.
We are now ready to go to lunch.
Now ready to go to lunch. Lunch is at main guest house.
Just one announcement. There are transfer vehicles to take you to main guest house for lunch. So you can make use of them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Organizing committee, anybody, please come over.